He was seen as useless, and everyone laughed at him. But one day, when his elderly owner was in danger, the cat did something no one expected. He saved her. Do you believe animals are capable of such acts? Share your stories in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, there are even more amazing stories ahead. There he was, sprawled out on the old, sunken couch like he owned the place. His belly, round from years of indulgence, rose and fell in a slow rhythm as he basked in the sunlight streaming through the window. The cat, aptly named Mr. Puff by his elderly owner, seemed to have mastered the art of doing absolutely nothing. His glossy fur, once a striking black, now showed a few streaks of gray, but his appetite and his knack for lazing about had only grown stronger with age. The neighbors were relentless in their mockery. Look at him, the king of the couch, they'd snicker as they passed by the window, where Mr. Puff often perched to stare at the outside world with half-lidded eyes. He wasn't like the energetic cats in the neighborhood who climbed fences or chased mice. No, Mr. Puff's idea of exercise was stretching one paw at a time before collapsing back into his favorite cushion. He's only good for two things, sleeping and eating, one neighbor said loudly, prompting a ripple of laughter among the others. Even the children joined in, pressing their faces against the glass to mimic his lazy demeanor. They'd puff up their cheeks and droop their eyes, mocking the way he always looked slightly bored and entirely uninterested in their antics. His daily routine was predictable to a fault. At sunrise, he would lazily saunter to his food bowl, waiting for his elderly owner, Mrs. Bennet, to fill it with his favorite tuna-flavored kibble. Once satisfied, he'd wander to the living room, leap, with some effort, onto the couch, and curl up in his sunlit spot. There he'd stay, only moving when hunger struck again or when Mrs. Bennet gave him a gentle nudge to remind him it was dinner time. To the neighbors, Mr. Puff was a joke, a caricature of a cat who defied every stereotype of agility and independence. If a burglar broke into that house, all he'd do was purr them to sleep, one man joked, sparking a round of chuckles. Mrs. Bennet, however, saw her beloved companion differently. "He's not lazy, he's just reserved," she would say with a smile, brushing off the neighbors' comments. She didn't mind his slow pace or his lack of interest in the outside world. To her, Mr. Puff was perfect. But what the neighbors didn't see, and what Mrs. Bennet herself would soon discover, was that beneath Mr. Puff's lazy demeanor lay something extraordinary. It just hadn't been called upon yet. For now, though, he remained the king of the couch, blissfully unaware of the ridicule he faced. He stretched out his paws, yawned a big, toothy yawn, and returned to the task he excelled at, doing absolutely nothing. Mrs. Bennet, or Grandma as everyone in the neighborhood affectionately called her, lived a quiet life. Her small, ivy-covered house was tucked away at the end of the cul-de-sac, a sanctuary of calm amidst the hum of the bustling neighborhood. Inside that house, her constant companion was Mr. Puff, a cat who seemed to mirror the slow, steady rhythm of her own life. To Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Puff wasn't just a pet. He was family. His quirks, his laziness, and even his overly round physique were endearing to her in ways outsiders couldn't understand. "He's just a cat, he doesn't need to be a hero," she'd often say with a chuckle when someone pointed out his lack of ambition. Every morning, Mrs. Bennet would shuffle into the kitchen, her slippers scuffing against the floor, and greet Mr. Puff with the same cheerful phrase, "Good morning, my soft pillow." It was a name that made her smile every time she said it, because that's exactly what he was to her, soft, warm, and always there when she needed comfort. Despite his reputation, Mr. Puff brought a kind of joy to Mrs. Bennet's life that nothing else could. He was her shadow, following her from room to room at a leisurely pace, and her confidant, silently listening to her as she talked about everything from her favorite TV shows to memories of her late husband. When the afternoons grew long and quiet, she'd settle into her old rocking chair with Mr. Puff sprawled across her lap, his purring a soothing soundtrack to her thoughts. Her neighbors didn't understand this bond. "Why don't you get a real cat?" one of them once asked, watching Mr. Puff snooze on the windowsill. Mrs. Bennet had only laughed. "Why would I need a real cat when I have him? He's real enough for me." Of course, Mrs. Bennet wasn't blind to Mr. Puff's flaws. She knew he was a little too fond of his food bowl and a little too averse to any kind of exertion. She often joked with him, saying, "You're lucky I don't ask you to pay rent for taking up so much of this couch." But her tone was always affectionate, never scolding. In truth, Mrs. Bennet admired Mr. Puff's ability to live so unapologetically. She saw a kind of wisdom in his laziness, as if he understood something about life that humans couldn't quite grasp. "He's content," she'd say to herself, watching him stretch out on the sunlit rug. "Isn't that what we all want?" What Mrs. Bennet didn't realize was how deeply Mr. Puff understood her in return. Though he might not have been the most active or agile of cats, his loyalty to her was unwavering. Whenever she felt tired or lonely, he seemed to sense it, curling up beside her or brushing against her legs to remind her she wasn't alone. They were a team, in their own peculiar way, a pair of quiet souls who found solace in each other. For now, life was simple, predictable, and calm. But the bond they shared would soon be tested in ways neither of them could have imagined. It began as an ordinary morning in Mrs. Bennet's cozy little house. The sun streamed softly through the lace curtains, and the faint hum of birds outside mixed with the comforting tick of the old grandfather clock. Mrs. Bennet had just finished feeding Mr. Puff his breakfast, chuckling as he eagerly nudged the bowl closer to himself with his paw. "Don't eat too fast, my soft pillow," she teased, patting his head affectionately. But as she made her way to the living room, something felt off. A sudden wave of dizziness washed over her, making her reach for the armrest of her chair. Her vision blurred, and her knees buckled. Before she could call for help, Mrs. Bennet crumpled to the floor, her body limp and unresponsive. The house fell eerily silent. The clock continued its steady tick-tock, and outside, the world carried on as if nothing had happened. But inside, the warm and safe haven of Mrs. Bennet's home, hope seemed to dim. Mr. Puff, still licking the last remnants of his breakfast, noticed something wasn't right. Cats are often accused of being aloof, but there was nothing indifferent about Mr. Puff in that moment. He padded cautiously into the living room, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of his beloved human lying motionless on the floor. For a moment, he stood there, his head tilting in confusion. Then, as if some long-dormant instinct awakened within him, Mr. Puff sprang into action. He approached her cautiously at first, sniffing her face and nuzzling her cheek. When she didn't respond, he let out a low, anxious meow, one that grew louder and more insistent as seconds ticked by. But it wasn't enough. Mr. Puff seemed to realize that meowing alone wouldn't bring her back. That's when he did something completely unexpected. He climbed onto her chest, his soft paws pressing against her shoulders, then her collarbone, and finally over her heart. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, he began kneading her chest. His rhythmic motions, so often used to lull himself into comfort, now seemed purposeful, almost calculated. His purring, normally a soothing hum, became louder and more resonant, vibrating through Mrs. Bennet's still form. It was as if he was trying to send waves of life back into her body, refusing to let her go without a fight. Time seemed to stretch endlessly, but Mr. Puff didn't stop. He alternated between pressing his paws on her chest and nudging her face with his head, his sharp green eyes watching for any sign of movement. The lazy, uninterested cat the neighbors mocked was nowhere to be seen. In his place was a determined, loyal companion who wouldn't abandon the person who had always cared for him. Finally, a faint sound escaped Mrs. Bennet's lips, a weak, almost inaudible moan. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, and her fingers twitched. Mr. Puff froze for a moment, staring down at her as if to confirm what he'd just seen. Then, with renewed energy, he let out a triumphant yell and continued his efforts. Outside, the world remained oblivious, but inside that little house, a miracle was unfolding. Mr. Puff, the so-called king of the couch, was proving that even the laziest of souls could rise to the occasion when it mattered most. From an outsider's perspective, it might have looked absurd, a fluffy cat, round and slow by reputation, performing what seemed like CPR. But in that quiet room, it was nothing short of extraordinary. As his purring grew louder and his paws continued their work, Mrs. Bennet's chest began to rise and fall in shallow but noticeable breaths. A small groan escaped her lips, her fingers twitching slightly against the carpet. Mr. Puff paused again, tilting his head and studying her intently. His tail flicked once, as if to signal his triumph, before he leaned forward to nudge her cheek with his nose. It was a gentle gesture, a reassurance that he was still there. Though she hadn't fully woken, Mrs. Bennet was beginning to stir, and Mr. Puff's persistence didn't waver. He stayed by her side, his paws continuing their rhythmic work, his purring filling the room like a lifeline. The lazy cat everyone underestimated was proving to be far more than he seemed, a rescuer with a heart as big as his belly. Mr. Puff had done everything he could to rouse Mrs. Bennet. His relentless kneading and powerful purring had brought faint signs of life, but it wasn't enough. The room felt heavy with silence, broken only by the faint sound of her shallow breaths. Something inside him, a deep, primal instinct, told him that he needed help. And he needed it now. He leapt off her chest with surprising agility for a cat who normally avoided any unnecessary movement. Landing softly on the carpet, he padded toward the front door, his tail swishing in determination. His usual slow, deliberate gait was replaced by frantic energy. He reached the door and began scratching furiously, his claws scraping against the wood with a noise sharp enough to pierce the quiet. When scratching didn't seem to produce immediate results, he added his voice to the effort. Mr. Puff let out a loud, desperate yowl, a sound unlike anything he'd made before. It wasn't the lazy meow of a cat asking for dinner or the playful chirp he used to beg for attention. This was a raw, insistent cry, one that seemed to say, "Come now. It's urgent." But the house remained still, its walls swallowing his cries. Unwilling to give up, Mr. Puff darted back to Mrs. Bennet, his green eyes scanning her motionless form. He nuzzled her hand briefly, as if to reassure himself that she was still there. Then, with renewed determination, he bolted back to the door. This time, his tactics became more frantic. He leapt at the door, his paws thudding against it as he scrambled to scratch higher. He meowed again and again, his voice echoing down the hallway. His movements became almost theatrical, running back to Mrs. Bennet, circling her, then charging back to the door as if he were trying to create a visible commotion. Outside, the street was quiet. The neighbors were going about their day, oblivious to the unfolding drama inside the little house. But Mr. Puff wasn't about to let them stay unaware. His meows grew louder, more persistent, until they reached a fever pitch. A dog in a neighboring yard began barking in response, startled by the unusual sounds coming from the house. A few birds scattered from the nearby trees. The disruption was small but noticeable, enough to catch the attention of one of the neighbors passing by. "Is that Mrs. Bennet's cat?" the man muttered to himself, pausing to glance at the house. He knew Mr. Puff, of course everyone did. The lazy cat who never made a fuss, who was often found sunbathing in the window or lounging on the porch. But now, the sight of Mr. Puff's frantic scratching and the sound of his mournful cries sent a chill down his spine. That's not normal, the man thought, stepping closer to the house. Inside, Mr. Puff seemed to sense the presence of someone outside. He doubled down on his efforts, his paws moving with wild energy as he clawed at the door and let out another desperate yowl. The man, now fully alarmed, knocked on the door. "Mrs. Bennet? Are you all right?" he called, pressing his ear against the wood. Mr. Puff immediately responded with another sharp cry, his voice rising as if to say, "Help her." The neighbor didn't wait for another sign. He pushed open the unlocked door and stepped inside, his heart racing as he followed the sound of the distressed cat. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. Mr. Puff was pacing around Mrs. Bennet, occasionally nudging her hand with his head, then looking up at the neighbor with pleading eyes. "Oh no," the man whispered, rushing to her side. As he pulled out his phone to call for help, Mr. Puff sat beside Mrs. Bennet, his purring softening but his watchful eyes never leaving her. The cat had done his job. Help had arrived. The lazy, indifferent Mr. Puff, who once seemed good for nothing but naps and snacks, had defied every expectation. His loud, insistent cries had pierced the mundane noise of the world outside and brought someone to save his beloved owner. And for the first time, the neighbors would see him as more than just that lazy cat in the window. As he spoke to the operator, other neighbors began to gather outside, drawn by the commotion. Mr. Thompson, who had always joked about Mr. Puff being the laziest cat in town, stepped inside and took one look at the scene. His jaw tightened as he realized what had happened. "That cat, he's been trying to get our attention," he said quietly, almost in disbelief. Mrs. Collins, peering in from the doorway, added, "I never thought he had it in him. He's been acting like a little hero." While the neighbors murmured among themselves, Mr. Puff refused to leave Mrs. Bennet's side. He stayed close, his tail curled protectively around her arm, his purring softer now but steady, like a heartbeat. When the paramedics arrived, they found not only a frail woman in need of urgent care but also a determined cat who had refused to let her be forgotten. The neighbors, who had spent years chuckling at Mr. Puff's apparent laziness, now saw him in a completely different light. "He's not just a cat," Mr. Jacobs said, shaking his head as the paramedics carried Mrs. Bennet out on a stretcher. "He's her guardian." Outside, as the ambulance pulled away, the neighbors lingered, their eyes following the small black figure still sitting at the window, watching the flashing lights disappear down the street. For once, no one was laughing at Mr. Puff. Instead, they stood in quiet admiration, realizing that even the laziest of creatures can rise to the occasion when it matters most. The hospital room was quiet, save for the gentle beep of monitors and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. Mrs. Bennet lay on the bed, her frail frame surrounded by crisp white sheets. Though tired, her face carried a peaceful expression. She was alive, and she owed it to an unlikely hero, her lazy, soft-pawed companion, Mr. Puff. The doctors were astonished when they heard the story. "It's remarkable," one of them said, glancing at Mrs. Bennet's chart. The chest compressions he performed likely stimulated enough circulation to keep her stable until help arrived. And the noise he made, he knew to alert someone. "You're lucky to have him." Mrs. Bennet's eyes filled with tears as she listened. "Lucky," she said weakly. "I've always been lucky to have him. I just didn't realize how lucky." Back at home, the neighborhood was abuzz with talk of Mr. Puff's heroic act. The same neighbors who once mocked him for being lazy and useless were now singing his praises. "I can't believe it," Mrs. Collins said, shaking her head as she retold the story to another neighbor. That cat did more to save her life than most people would have thought possible." Even Mr. Thompson, who had been one of Mr. Puff's most relentless critics, stood humbled. "Guess I owe the little guy an apology," he admitted. When Mrs. Bennet finally returned home, she was greeted by a wave of support and a very proud Mr. Puff. The moment she settled back into her favorite chair, he leapt onto her lap, his purring louder than ever. She laughed softly, stroking his head. "My little hero," she whispered. "My soft-pawed savior." The neighbors no longer laughed at Mr. Puff. Instead, they began leaving treats and toys on Mrs. Bennet's porch as tokens of admiration for the cat who had proven everyone wrong. The children who once mocked him now pointed excitedly when they saw him in the window, calling him Super Cat and the Hero Kitty. For Mr. Puff, life hadn't changed much. He still loved his naps, still stretched out on the sunny windowsill, and still demanded his meals on time. But there was something different in the way he carried himself, a quiet confidence, as if he knew what he had done and why it mattered. Mrs. Bennet often found herself watching him with a smile, thinking about how the cat everyone underestimated had turned out to be her guardian angel. What do you think of this incredible story? Have you ever seen an animal rise to the occasion in an unexpected way? Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear them. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more amazing tales of love, courage, and unexpected heroes. Your support means the world to us.